You know, hype can be one hell of a drug. On the one hand, it's great to get excited for new things, build in anticipation for what should hopefully be an awesome experience. On the other hand, hype can also lead to unreasonably high expectations that reality often struggles to live up to, just like going on a Tinder date. And the disappointment that follows can start to weigh on a man's soul after a while. So when people started hailing God of War Ragnarok as the best game, not just of last year but possibly its entire generation, I was understandably skeptical. In fact, it actually put me off playing the thing for a month or so because I wanted to wait until the hype had died down and I could just enjoy the thing at my own pace. And now that I've played it from start to finish and seen almost everything that the Nine Realms has to offer, what the hell did I think? Well, I'm pleased to say that the hype was mostly justified. God of War Ragnarok is a fantastic experience with challenging and rewarding gameplay, gorgeous graphics, superb voice acting, and a story that manages to be both epic in scale and also deeply personal and reflective. And apart from a few minor gameplay gripes that I'm going to get into shortly, I'd strongly recommend it to anyone looking for a decent adventure to keep them busy for 40 or 50 hours. Anyway, grab your blades of chaos and let's shed some light on this story. So Ragnarok is set about 3 years after the events of the previous God of War game. Kratos and his son Atreus have been living together in Midgard, keeping their heads down and trying to avoid Freya, who's understandably still sore about the whole killing her son thing from the last game. God, some people just can't move on. Atreus is older now, and the more powerful and independent-minded he becomes, the more it brings him into conflict with his controlling father. Unfortunately, things take a turn for the worse when Odin shows up one day with his son Thor to strike a bargain with Kratos. Both sides know that Ragnarok is on the way, the climactic final battle destined to bring about the destruction of the Nine Realms and the fall of the gods. Naturally, Odin's not too keen for this to happen, so he presents Kratos with an offer. Stay the hell out of his way and they'll have no beef with each other. And well, Kratos handles this kind of diplomacy about as well as you might expect. So the race is on for father and son, first to find a way of changing the prophecy and avoiding the destruction that's going to come with Ragnarok, and then later when war becomes inevitable, to forge an uneasy alliance between the other realms and lead them against Odin and his armies in Asgard. Along the way, tensions and rifts begin to form within the group as different factions pursue different objectives, unexpected alliances bring old enemies together, and betrayals threaten to tear friends apart. And at the centre of it all is the increasingly strained relationship between Kratos and Atreus as they strive to either change their fates or meet them head on, each keeping secrets and telling lies, and making difficult decisions that could change the outcome of the entire war. Honestly, I could probably spend hours talking about every aspect of this game's story, the excellent character development woven into the narrative, the complex web of deception and revelation that gradually brings about a clearer understanding, and the fascinating exploration of the nature of fate and destiny, whether events really are predetermined or whether our belief in them is what makes them real. But I think it's enough to say that for a game centered around a big angry bald man who uses giant wrist-mounted swords to tear people in half, God of War Ragnarok is a pretty fucking interesting story filled with even more interesting characters. I mean, it's kind of amazing to think that we started off with this.
Wretched beast! I know who it is you serve! Return to your master! Tell the God of War I am his no longer!
And ultimately ended up with this.
Loki will go. Atreus remains.
The centrepiece of the narrative is without doubt the father-son relationship between Kratos and Atreus, and I think this is where the story really shines compared to its predecessor. Don't get me wrong, God of War had a great story in its own right, it's just that everything's a bit more fleshed out, a bit more thoughtful, a bit more nuanced and mature and reflective this time around. As much as the first game was about a reluctant father doing his best to shield his son from a dangerous world and some even more dangerous revelations about himself, Ragnarok is about the same son beginning to grow up and make decisions for himself, and the friction that generates between them. Kratos is no longer the dominant force in Atreus' life. He can't just order him around and expect him to obey without question. It's the same shift in dynamic that plays out between fathers and sons every single day in every part of the world. As one grows into a man and gets ready to forge his own path in life, so the other has to reckon with his own mortality, begin to step back and trust him to find his own way. And I think this is the first game in the series to really grapple with the fact that Kratos is getting older now. He's tired and battle scarred after all of his adventures, and perhaps beginning to contemplate his own end. I mean, he's still an absolute force of nature in combat, but you really get the sense that all of this stuff weighs more heavily on him than it used to, that he doesn't really want to be this person anymore. And that idea of striving to be a better man and let the past go really comes through during some of the climactic scenes near the ends.
No more. No more. For the sake of our children, we must be better.
And all of this is made possible by an absolutely stellar performance from Christopher Judge, who sells every single line of dialogue like he's pouring his heart and soul into it. His Kratos is a gruff, stoic man of few words, but in those little moments where he shows a hint of emotion and vulnerability, or tenderness and compassion, it hits harder than any of the overblown hysterics you get in most media these days. Here's a little hint, ladies and gentlemen of Hollywood. When it comes to showing emotional vulnerability in strong male characters, less is absolutely more. And that's not to take away from any of the other voice cast who all turn excellent performances in themselves. Especially Odin, who I wasn't sure about at first, but quickly grew on me as a scheming, manipulative antagonist, putting on the facade of an affable, ineffectual old man. The kind of guy you could imagine happily pottering around in his garden workshop tinkering with old engine parts. He's less of a physical powerhouse and more of an intellectual opponent who's been at this stuff a lot longer than you have. And the more time you spend with him, the more you come to understand his goals and ideas, and even find yourself starting to agree with him at times. This is what we like to call good writing. On the gameplay side of things, it's your standard God of War structure, so if you've played the last game, then you'll be able to dive right into this one with zero problems. The game world's divided up into open areas where you can take on little side quests and objectives, either to drive the story forward or just as little side hustles to earn extra bonuses and items. Either way, they usually lead into the game's bread and butter of smaller, self-contained levels that you have to fight and explore your way through, solving simple problems and traversing platform and climbing sections along the way. I mean, none of this stuff is particularly difficult. The puzzles aren't likely to hold you up for very long. The climbing sections lock you into one specific path, and your way forward is so obvious that it's really just a case of following the markers to progress. In fact, I don't think it's even possible to die by falling off a platform or missing a jump, which kind of takes the challenge out of world traversal. The game also has this slightly annoying habit of making the side characters spit out the solution to a problem if you take too long to solve it. And by too long, I mean like 30 seconds. I get that the devs don't want players being stumped and frustrated by a puzzle they totally don't understand, but come on, you don't have to hold their hand at every single turn. Horizon Forbidden West pulled the same trick, and it was just as unnecessary and intrusive there. It really feels like the devs don't want to take the chance that you'll get lost in some sprawling maze of a level, or stuck on a tricky problem for too long, and just want to get you to the next combat section as quickly as possible. I mean, it is a God of War game after all, so it's simple linear level design and hand-holding galore. Combat itself is simple, straightforward, and mostly good fun. You've got a couple of different weapons with different abilities and specialities, so learning which one to use in which situation and switching between them on the fly is a pretty important skill to master. You've also got a shield, and if you time it right, you can parry enemy attacks and retaliate with powerful counters of your own, and there's a skill tree to develop special moves and extra combos over time. It's a little nod towards introducing some RPG elements into the game, but you end up with more than enough resources to max out everything, so it's not like you ever have to make tough decisions about which areas to specialise in. You've also usually got a companion along for the ride, with their own unique attacks and special abilities, and you can either let them do their own thing, or if you like winning, you can instruct them to target whatever enemy you're about to engage, so you can stun lock them in place for a few seconds while you wail on them. What this all means is that combat is fun and engaging enough, and some of the finishers are absolutely brutal, but it's never particularly challenging from a gameplay point of view. Yeah, some of the tougher bosses might hold you up for a while until you figure out their patterns, but it's not like Elden Ring where a single mistimed parry can mean the difference between life and death. Ragnarok is aimed very much at casual gamers like me who want a bit of a challenge without tearing their hair out after dying for the 500th time. Another thing that jumped out at me about this game was the pacing, in that the first couple of hours are definitely the hardest to plow through. Not because they're challenging or difficult, but because the game won't let you fucking play them. I mean, don't get me wrong, I understand there's a lot of story and character to set up, but honestly, those first few hours feel like you're given control for a couple of minutes at a time before the game throws you into another extended cutscene. Or even worse, forces you to walk down a fixed path while scripted dialogue plays out, where your control is so limited that it might as well just be a movie. Honestly, I thought we were past this whole walking simulator crap, but apparently not. Like I say, this is really just a temporary thing, and the game opens up once you've churned through that initial segment, so it's not a huge issue for me, but first impressions do count, and I can imagine more than a few people getting turned off by a game that doesn't seem to want to let them play it. There also seems to be this weird implication floating around that Ragnarok is somehow a woke game, and honestly, I just don't get it. Either I'm missing something that other people are clearly seeing, or they might be projecting things that aren't actually there. I never once got the feeling that the game was trying to crowbar in some clumsy and inappropriate political ideology to its story, or elevate certain characters at the expense of others. Yeah, female characters like Freya and Thrud are depicted as powerful warriors that can hold their own even against someone like Kratos, because they're literal gods. But they're also complex, flawed, and well-written individuals in their own right, and by the end, Freya doesn't just respect Kratos, she defers to him. The only thing I can possibly come up with that people might take issue with is Angrboda, who looks a bit out of place in a story that's all about Norse mythology, but in the context of interdimensional realm travel, wildly exotic landscapes, cultures, different races, and even species, a few characters with different skin tones is probably the least unusual thing you're gonna see. And it's not like she's even used to make some awkward point about contemporary social issues, she's just a character who's there to fill you in on some backstory, and that's pretty much it. I guess my point here is that while it's important to call out divisive identity politics in media, it doesn't mean that it exists everywhere, and if you start trying to find it where it doesn't really exist, it just becomes a witch hunt that spoils your enjoyment of stuff you might otherwise end up loving. Sometimes it's okay to acknowledge that even modern productions can just be, well, good. And ultimately, that's exactly what Ragnarok is for me. It's a game that successfully broadens out its narrative to explore events from different perspectives and offers up a more thoughtful and mature storyline, but it never once loses sight of its main man. Kratos is still the undisputed king of the hill in this game, the narrative focal point, the god of war, just as it always should be. And if Ragnarok is anything to go by, well, I'll be interested to follow him on his next adventure, that's for sure. Anyway, that's all I've got for today. Go away now.